Hi, and welcome to episode 156 of Page One, the Writers' Podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tarek.
And thanks for joining us on the podcast, where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And this week, we've got a very special guest who has been a journalist, an editor, written lots of non-fiction books, and is just published his debut fiction novel.
Yeah, very exciting. We're chatting with Mr. Stig Abell, who, as Marco says, has kind of worked at the Press Complaints Commission. He was a director there for a while. Then he was editor at The Sun. He was in ILBC Radio. He was editor of the Times Literary Supplement. Now he's a Times Radio breakfast show host. I mean, it's pretty incredible back catalogue of roles he's had. And he's had a couple of factual books out already, and as Marco says, this is his very first fiction book, crime fiction book, Death Under a Little Sky.
Yeah, and as we'll hear in the interview, he's a real, he's loved reading books all his life. He's reviewed books. He obviously really knows crime fiction, especially, and it was a really fascinating chat talking to him about his love of books, his love of writing, and how he fits it in, because being a breakfast radio presenter, he's getting up at 3 a.m, he's then coming back, he's got young kids and all this sort of stuff, so he sort of talks about squeezing writing in when you can, and sort of getting that momentum going, and that's how you keep going with it. So it's a really fascinating chat. So we'll get straight into it after a quick advert for our writer's notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop, so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy, and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realise it's not just a story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Did you always want to be a writer? Because obviously you've had quite a varied career.
I think I probably did always want to be a writer at some level, but I didn't necessarily think it was a sort of thing to end up doing. I mean, when I left university, I reviewed a lot of books. I was a book reviewer for sort of 10 years. And so I mean, I've always loved books from the very early age. Books have been really, really, really important to me. So I've always seen books as really central to my life. And I really enjoyed reviewing them.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone had put a gun to my head and said, would you like to be a writer? I'd have definitely said yes. But I'm not sure I necessarily would have thought I could have done it. So it wasn't something that I thought was just a massive career option. It just felt something that I would have loved to have done. And it's turned out that I've ended up doing it. But even 5 years ago, it didn't necessarily feel, particularly in fiction, like a realistic opportunity.
I mean, is it something though that, because obviously you studied English at uni, but was writing something that you did at all? Were you writing short stories or anything like that, or not really? It was more the sort of non-fiction reviewing side of things that you were doing.
I did a lot of non-fiction reviewing stuff, but I did used to write stuff for my wife, particularly in the early stages of our relationship, as a kind of way of it's not, I don't want to say courting because I sound like some sort of Regency butt, but in the early stages I used to send her short stories of thinly veiled characters based on me and her, and I also sent her stories with a content that I would be very sad if they ever became public as well. So I did write a novel kind of in my 20s, which again I wouldn't be thrilled if anyone, I don't even know where it is. It's probably on an old computer somewhere. So I'd written a sort of serial killer novel, and I'd written quite a few sort of stories, but really just for the amusement of my wife, and then I'd sort of left it there.
And obviously you've as I said at the start, you've had a variety of jobs. You were a newspaper editor, you did the book reviews, you now obviously present a show on Times Radio. But what was it that made you think, right, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to, give this a serious go at writing?
So the cliche answer a bit is coronavirus, but only because I was working through COVID. So I was involved in launching Times Radio, which launched in it was June of the first lockdown, right. So right in the heart of coronavirus. Yeah. So it wasn't as if I had one of those COVID things where I was stuck at home for 8 hours looking for things to do. So I wasn't really that part of it, that I didn't have a lot of time on my hands and suddenly I wanted to do it. I guess it was always been like lurking there. And so in some ways it was back to writing for my wife, because I used to, whenever I've had a couple of hours, I'd write a few hundred words, 1,500 words, and I'd send it to her. And then it just built from there. And, and you probably both know this, once you've kind of written 10,000 words, 12,000 words, 15,000 words, it starts to feel like maybe that's a thing.
Yeah.
And with Death Under a Little Sky, I sort of got to the point where it's 15,000 words. I thought, well, maybe actually this is a novel. And, maybe it's... And so then I just thought, I'm going to write it. I didn't even think about publishing it, really. I had a deal to write a non-fiction book, which I've still not done yet. The idea, so I wrote the whole thing, and then I've got a literary agent for my non-fiction stuff, and I sent it to her and said, I've written this thing. It's okay. I've already done it, and I genuinely loved doing it, and it was such a pleasure to do. So if it comes to nothing, I don't really care very much. And she didn't want to read it because she didn't want to turn around and say it was rubbish, her words exactly to my face. And then she did read it, and then it got to Harper Collins and they liked it and they wanted another one. So it kind of went from there. But the motivation to write it was really just for the pleasure of writing it, I think.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, obviously that wasn't your first actual book that you'd ever written, because you've written a couple of factual books previously. And I wondered, was that kind of a more obvious book for you to write, the factual books? Were they more kind of obvious route for you to go into the book writing world based on your career?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, again, I wouldn't have done it probably, but an editor at John Murray, who I didn't know, came to see me. And I'd written some stuff for the TLS. And like I said, I've written quite a lot of stuff over the years in newspapers. And he said to me, would you ever consider writing a book? And I had this idea, and generally a lot of what I'd done, even at the TLS, was this idea of explainers, trying to understand relatively complicated things and explaining them. And so the idea of the first book, really, how Britain really works, was just this gigantic explainer of all the different institutions in Britain. And so, like you say, it's a very clear link between my job, which was kind of either being on the radio, talking about stuff, or editing a magazine like the TLS, which explained things, to being a sort of book that was just this giant explainer. It was a very straightforward concept, really. And so that was in that sense, it seemed like quite not an easy, but a more simple method of getting into books.
But did that experience of, all of your writing experience, I guess, before you sat down and started writing Death Under a Little Sky, did that assist in writing the fiction book in any way? Is it even just having the discipline to write and that sort of thing? Does that help you start that journey?
I think it does, and I really do believe this, that actually a lot of writing to me is just doing it.
Yeah,
like you can sit around thinking about it an awful lot. Actually, I find the fact of just sitting and writing, if it's done right in your mind, is a great pleasure, but B, it's a momentum thing. And I think my fiction publishers, Harper Collins, now think it very funny because I've delivered 2 books, well within the time allotted for the second one, because ultimately I just want to do it. And if they said to me tomorrow, I'm not publishing this anymore, I'd probably still write another one.
Yeah.
Because to me, it's about exactly that. It's momentum, it's rhythm. This is true of nonfiction. Nonfiction is harder because you've got to do the research.
Yeah.
So you've got to do a body of work and then the body of work. Whereas fiction, at least for me, is a certain amount of plotting and planning, but not that much. I like quite a simple skeleton of where it might go, and then again trust this notion of just doing it, and actually sort of writing by continually doing, to me, is the way I do it. And actually, that's true of nonfiction as of fiction. It's slightly more straightforward in fiction because there's less of the scaffolding of research to build up first.
I mean, I think that is like one of the secret. It seems like an obvious secret, but it is getting into a habit with writing is so important, because if you just wait for the day that you fancy doing it, then you'll never finish anything, I suspect.
And also, I think that because virtually no one is a professional writer, particularly at the beginning, can earn enough money doing it.
Yeah.
I've always had to juggle it with full-time jobs effectively. And, I wrote Death Under Little Sky, launching a radio station and then doing a breakfast show. So I get up at 3 a.m, get to work at 4, go on the radio 6 till 10, bit of work after, and then I sort of on a train home at around lunchtime. And even something as simple as every time I'm on a train for 40 minutes, I'm going to work, I'm going to write, I'm going to put classical music in my headphones, have my laptop in front of me, and I'm just going to write. And then when I get home, do some exercise, and then probably do another hour's writing. It's not that much. I mean, that's the other thing I find, that I don't know if all the people you spoke to, if you've got other jobs to do and life and family and kids and all of that, there aren't that many hours in the day you can write. So you've got to work out where they are and say, I've probably only got 2 hours to write today. And therefore I better write in those 2 hours, because if I miss them, they're not coming back to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. You've got to take it, and that in itself is a skill as well, to learn that you don't sit down and spend an hour sort of warming up to then start writing. If you've got limited time, then you just have to grab that time when it's available, I suspect. And you sort of alluded to it there, that you plan a little bit, but it doesn't sound like you're sort of 10 spreadsheets and all of that sort of thing when you're planning your books.
No, and funnily enough, so we're talking now, and the first one is about to come out, but I've just finished the first draft of the third one. And I'm probably getting slightly more sophisticated as I go along. But, there's some authors, James Elroy writes a 400-page outline and then a 400-page novel, which is sort of fleshing out of the outline, which is, and at his best, you can see why he does that, because it's sort of, when he's doing the genius that is American Tabloid or Cold 6000, you can imagine how much
try
effort
to pull everything together.
But just incredible. But Lee Child, he just sits down on the same day every year, has created Jack Reacher, the concept of a road, and drinking coffee and eating hamburgers and kicking the crap out of people. And then off he goes. And it's obviously much more sophisticated than that. But my understanding of talking to him is he really just follows his nose on it and lets it sort of pursue it where it may. And I'm probably between those two things. I think particularly with crime stuff, you've got to plan a bit so you can work out where people are and where you're going to get to and who did it and stuff like that. I know Agatha Christie, I think she didn't always know who did it until the end. I think she sort of got the pieces in place and then worked out who was the least likely.
Yeah.
and then got that person to do it. So I'm probably a certain amount of making sure I have the beginning and the end, who did it. But beyond that, just trusting the process of writing all the time. And then actually in my little bag where I keep my computer, I've got loads and loads of scraps of paper where either I've just written down, oh, this should happen next, or here are the 4 things that need to happen next. And because I have a drive to work at 3 o'clock in the morning, where I sort of sit in the back of a car at 3 in the morning, which is miserable. It's as miserable as it sounds. It's awful. And in COVID, of course, it was that in a mask, which was really awful. But so sometimes there, I sort of put my hood up and sort of tie it up until you can't really see me, and I close my eyes, and I quite often do sort of plot stuff in my head there, just thinking ahead, and then I might get to work and write down 2 sentences like, he needs to get to there, or it would make sense if he finds her doing that. And I find that little bits of plots being uncorked that way works just by constantly thinking about it, and then when you get a bit of clarity, sort of scrawling it down.
And how many drafts do you tend to do? Are you quite a clean writer? Is your first draft quite close to the finished product, or do you go through quite a lot of drafts? I'm
not a brilliant editor of myself, I don't think. So I think it's relatively clean. I do a first draft and then a cleaned up version of the first draft, and then that's it really. Although my second one, which is now the sequel to Death Under a Little Sky, I handed it in again, really having done it for pleasure and just got ahead and got down and did it. And I had this slightly awkward meeting with the editors at Harper Collins, and they said, look, we really like the book. We like the first half and we like the second half, but we don't think those 2 books have anything to do with each other. And the second half, and so Death Under a Little Sky is quite a sprawling, rural, it's sort of one of the main characters really in the book is Little Sky, this sort of imaginary place which has got beautiful land. And so the idea of, this is where it came out of coronavirus, the idea of space and isolation and all that stuff which came from it. And the second book ended becoming a bit of a country house mystery. And the editors said to me, we like it, but we don't think you should be doing that for the second book. The first half, before you get to this country house, we really like, and the second half will be a perfectly good country house mystery, but we don't think that's a very good idea. So what I did with that one was I more or less tied the first 40,000 words, and I took the second 40,000 words and deleted them.
Deleted them, or just kept them in a different file?
Well, I've put them in another file, but I've effectively deleted them, I think, really. And then reshaped the second half completely. So that was an example of that was eventually, therefore, the third draft of this being drastically different because someone had taken a look at it and said, you need to change the shape of it.
Was it quite hard to hear that? You have to have quite a thick skin for these kind of stuff?
Do you know what? I've always believed that you should listen to experts. Like they do that job for a reason. And so I probably harumphed a bit. I don't know how you'd have felt about it. I kind of harumphed a bit in my mind. And there's a little tiny part of my brain that had already thought, have I sent this in the wrong place? I don't know if you agree with this, but particularly with crime books, there's a danger of getting yourself into a cul-de-sac where you make several decisions and that's the only place you can get to. Maybe that place isn't the right place. And there was probably a little kind of hint in the back of my mind, oh, have I taken that to the wrong place? So when they said it, I kind of knew they were right. And I also thought you should always trust people who know what they're doing. And generally they're such a supportive, clever bunch of people. I just thought they clearly know. And so I sort of stumped about for a day, and then I thought, yeah, you're right. I better just.
I'm sure it is in fact Lee Child that said that when he gets editor's notes, if there's like, say, take a number of 20 of them, he'll look at them all and say they're all rubbish the first time, and then leave it for an hour, and then go, okay, well maybe that's got a good point, and then a few hours later, okay, those 5 as well, and then within a couple of days, all of them have been accepted. But it takes that time as a writer to sort of accept that feedback, I think.
And because there's no obvious right answer, it's not like you can really appeal to anything.
Yeah,
and you're dealing with
true,
and you're dealing with hypotheticals because you've got, you don't know what an audience would make of it. They're never going to see that version of the book, and so it's not like you can really rely on anything empirical. You've just got to say. And like I said, I probably knew. And that's the nervousness about it, isn't it? That even if you've got a book accepted, it's still, do they really like it? What will they come back? When that first bunch of things come back. I remember with Death in the Little Sky, they were totally right about this, but I'd deliberately written it from from Jake Jackson, who's the central character's point of view. So there was a load of stuff. The whole thing's from his, the narrator effectively sitting over his shoulder, sort of free and direct style. It's really Jake's perspective. But then some of the book is a bit about the male gaze and how that looks at other people. So I'd written a couple of things where the point of view was just reversed and someone was looking at him. Mm-hmm. And I'd done that deliberately. And then I remember one of the editors came back to me and was like, why you just changed the point of view there? And I was like, yeah, I'm doing it deliberately. and they were so nice about it. And they were like, well, have a think about it. Maybe, I'm just thinking it's weird. Maybe don't do that. And I'm doing a thing about the male gaze. And she thought, I understand that, but have a think about it. And then by the time we got to, the second or third exchange, I was like, yeah, you're right. I'll get rid of it. and so I did.
And what was your path for having an agent? Because, am I right in saying, is it the same agent you have for your fiction books as you have for your factual books? Or did you start from scratch? No, same person.
So this is why I'm a bit lucky, I think. So I've got this amazing agent, and I think the quality of an agent is a you're either lucky or not lucky. This agent is called Kath Summerhays, and she's a real proper agent. She does many authors bigger than me, but I'd met her really through the TLS stuff and just a bit being in the literary world. I met someone who knew her, and they'd said to me, "Oh, you should meet Kath." And said to Kath, "Oh, he may write a book one day. Why don't you meet him?" And so that was very lucky. That was the kind of function of me being in that world without ever really writing a book. And so she'd said to me, "Oh, if you ever do that, I'll get involved." And so she was my agent for the first two books. And like I said, I then sent to this fiction book, and she was a bit like, "Oh God, I really don't have to turn around and say this is awful." But then she liked it enough to get the deal done with Harper Collins. So it was the same one, and I lucked into her. And I wonder, how do you meet agents? It's difficult, and it's so much of this is random. I think one of the hardest things whenever you're doing writing, I think writing books, is how many variables are beyond your control.
Yeah,
you can write a book. And there's no way, again, this is all hypothetical. There's no way of actually doing a controlled experiment. But I reckon if you got 50 books, you could plot 50 different routes to success or failure for each of them.
Absolutely.
And there's no real way of controlling that. And so the nature of your agent, who they happen to speak to, whether they love it, what do Waterstones think of your book? What does a seller in Waterstones think of your book? A million different things. What's just been published, what's about to be published, what fits in with a magazine editor's view of the world. There's so much randomness in all of this, which is why it's so kind of heartbreaking when you worry about the prospects for your book. You can't really control very much of it. And I lucked into her. She's a brilliant agent.
Yeah, no, that's so right. So many of our guests we've talked to, you've obviously got to get the words down, get something that you're happy with on paper. But at the end of the day, there is so many things like timing. Is this the right book, the type of book that particular agent is looking for at that time, and all of that sort of thing? Everything needs to come together for it all to work out, I think. But obviously, Death Under a Little Sky is a crime book. I think I read that when you were growing up, talking about you mentioned earlier how much you loved books before. You were a big Sherlock Holmes and Poirot fan. Has crime always been your genre, your go-to genre?
Yeah, and I think it's because I grew up in. So I'm 42, very nearly 43. So I was born in 1980, and so I'm just at the edge of being a millennial. I'm not quite a millennial. I'm not quite the previous generation, but that generation, my generation, is the one which I didn't get a mobile phone till I was 20. Mm-hmm. I didn't get an email address till I went to university in 1998. I had a pager. That's and so I was of a generation where there's no Amazon. Books were expensive. You couldn't really get cheap books. I'm from a town called Loughborough. I don't remember there being a particularly vibrant bookstore, particularly vibrant secondhand books. There were a few charity shops, but not much. So you read what was in your parents' house. Mm-hmm. So I read 70s thrillers. That was the sort of staple for me. And so that included crime fiction, but also John le Carré, Len Deighton, stuff like that. So, but genre fiction.
Yeah.
And I have this great joy always in well-written genre fiction, which I think is in many ways the acme of the reading experience. When you combine someone who can write well with someone who wants to tell a story without getting diverted by their sense of literariness, I kind of think is the perfect combination. And so I grew up on thrillers, really, and then Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie and crime books. And the crime genre is so capacious, so it sort of splits at the beginning. In Britain, you get Dorothy Sayers and Marjorie Allingham, and they're sort of very female, more sedate, slightly more cerebral stuff. And then in America, it goes the other way. It goes Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and the hard-boiled stuff. And I loved all of it. I know I loved, Sherlock Holmes. I think it's amazing that almost the first person who came up with the genre probably wrote the best examples of it, even 150 years later.
That's a good point. Yeah,
it's kind of crazy if you think about it. Conan Doyle basically invented and perfected the thing in one go, which I'm not sure has ever really happened elsewhere. But what he also did, he just allowed this great, generous concept of what it might be. And because it's almost endless where that can go, the different permutations are. It's a very generous one. And now I've said somewhere else that I'm like, in Rats in London, you're never more than 6 feet away from a rat. So I'm never more than 6 feet away from a crime book. So there was always one in my bag. There's always one in my bathroom. There's always one by the side of my bed. I'm doing this interview in my living room, and you can see this big bank of books behind me. Half of them will be detective novels. From all parts of the world, from different perspectives and all that, but all sort of joined together. So yeah, I think it started with thrillers generally, the concept of the sort of 70s thriller, and then it became more detective crime books that followed on from that.
And I think I read in an interview with you that you've set your story in modern day, but as you just mentioned there, modern technologies come on a lot. It's not just kind of pagers now. It's everyone's got phones, there's internet, there's GPS. How do you get past that problem that a lot of older fiction just wouldn't work anymore because it would be so easy to find someone?
And look, I've said a bit glibly that the mobile phone can ruin crime fiction. Of course, it doesn't. There are brilliant writers who know how to handle it properly. Part of me just hates. I'm a sort of Luddite, and so part of me is sick to death of my phone, sick to death of my kids on their phones, and so a little bit of a protest about that. But I do like the idea of that genre of fiction, which is really until 2000, where it is people meeting face to face. It is very much I think the advent of technology does change fundamentally the pace and the direction of crime fiction. So the conceit really in Little Sky is Jake, the detective, he has a difficult marriage. They sort of agree to split up. He inherits this house in the middle of an unnamed county in England or Britain, which doesn't exist. There's no one place I modeled it on, but the concept really is this does definitely happen. You can go into the countryside in this country and there is no internet service at all, and there is no phone service, there's no TV. So he basically has become moored away from the modern world, and that's quite good for him because he brings a lot of baggage from the city life, from the cop life, and from his previous marriage. And so that kind of thematically works, but also it just means it's him in this beautiful area, meeting people face to face. He has a relationship with a woman where they end up communicating by hanging bits of cloth on a tree when they want to speak to each other, which is about as far as you can get from WhatsApp. So I was trying to think, what's the opposite of WhatsApp and Snapchat? And it's hanging a cloth on a tree. And so we have this detective, and actually he then, and I think will happen over the course of the series, because there's at least 4 in the series now. There are moments where he comes into contact with the state, which has technology still. Mm-hmm. And I think there's still an aspect of technology. I mean, there's a character in the first book called Alethea, who is this police support worker who sort of is brilliant with computers. She actually becomes more prominent in the next 2 books. So there are moments where she sort of is there to help him, and he can go and see her, and she's got a sort of phalanx of computer screens. But generally speaking, I can take him away from that as well and plop him back in his farmhouse with his sauna and his lake, away from all of those distractions.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I think we spoke to Louise Candless recently about this as well. This problem of technology and how many crime books are now sort of set in either in the country house or in the Highlands of Scotland or something like that, that sort of takes the modern technology out of the equation and allows authors to explore those, I guess, more traditional types of crime stories that there are. But as you say, there are also some really brilliant, modern crime novels set in cities where the technology is all there, and authors come up with a different solution to
Yeah, exactly. And actually, you can get brilliant stuff because where they're very clever and they use technology to bring surprises. So it's not that I think it's impossible, but I think also it just happened to coincide with this thing that I was interested in generally. And, I work on a news program, so I'm very conscious of, I suppose, stories about the way the world is going, and this idea of the Great Resignation, the idea of people moving out of cities, the idea of people so frustrated with technology that they're going back to old mobile phones that don't have the internet. There's definitely something there that I think, to me, is philosophically interesting. The idea of giving up and walking away and not being constantly glued to a screen, which is brilliant and the whole world is opened up, but also is potentially pernicious. This idea that for our children, my children, are 14, 11, and 4, they can never close the door on the world because the world is always there. And one of the fantasies, I suppose, of Death Under Little Sky is what would happen if you could close the door on the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about the phrase that the horrible phrase everyone always hears, which is "write what you know," and I wanted to know what that phrase means to you and whether that's the same meaning necessarily that perhaps a publishing house might have of it.
Yeah, I mean, write what you know. I mean, the danger of write what you know, I suppose, is that you end up just writing your own direct experience. And I think that can be a bit dangerous. And so part of this, I think part of this contains sort of philosophies I'm interested in. So there is a bit of write what I know. I am interested in this idea, like I say, of how technology has sort of taken over and what a response might be. But also it doesn't mean, I haven't lived in a desolated place in the countryside. I come from the Midlands and a bit country, a bit town. So it's not like I've conveyed a place that I know intimately. There is this question, isn't there, that can you write characters from different walks of life, from different ethnicities? And I'm really interested in that. And I think, my wife is mixed race. There's a mixed race character in the book, Livia. And so I'd like to think that when I expand the world a bit and people from different backgrounds come in, it won't be my background, but I'll try and find ways of making sure I understand those sides of things. I think if you only write precisely what you know and you're scared to write anything else, you're going to limit the world that you produce.
I mean, I think sometimes it can be, it's how you interpret the phrase, I suppose, but writing what you know can be potentially quite a wide thing if you're taking into account all the books you've read, everything like that, not just your own personal experiences. And I think sometimes people get funneled too down that latter sort of explanation of what it means.
Well, I like the idea, really, actually. I mean, there's lots of little literary jokes in the book. I mean, not too many. I mean, I don't want people to think it's this sort of postmodern metafictional thing, because it isn't. But there are little bits of other books in it. One of the chapter titles is what is it? A Morbid Curiosity in Bones or something, which is a Cadfael novel. The town where they live is near where they live is called Meryton, which is actually from Pride and Prejudice. And Livia is named after that. There's kind of a joke about a swim in a lake, which is to do with Pride and Prejudice. That's in the book. So there are books in this. Sherlock Holmes is mentioned. This is a book that is very much celebrates the notion of detective books. I mean, one of the things that Jake, my detective, gets from his uncle is this library of thrillers. And in his beautiful farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, he has 5,000, 6,000 books to read, which his uncle has given him. Now, that's a fantasy I think many of us can get on board with.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about researching? You obviously said for the non-fiction books, much more research involved. But did you do research for this, like in terms of things like, I'm just thinking sort of police procedures and stuff like that?
Yeah,
is that something that from reading all these books you maybe know already?
I think you know a bit of it. I do think the internet. This is the other side of the argument. You know, is that there are lots of things you can learn to do now. So I kind of learned how to build a sauna from scratch, because people do that. People do get the wood and they build what amounts to a shed, and they put tar paper on it and they insulate it and they put something in the middle, and you can build your own sauna, which Jake does at one point. And so I researched that. There's YouTube videos. I had a look at some of the stuff. And so actually I think that there's stuff you can do using the internet. There's stuff you can do with experience, in the sense of, going around looking at different birds and plants and the sounds they make. And so there's a bit of that as well, where some of the, I'm really keen on books that are tactile in some respects. I've always loved books with food in them, where even if it's just sort of offhand, there's a bit which is, I remember reading Hemingway when I was a kid, and his first book, Fiesta, Sun Also Rises. Anyway, at one point they're in the mountains somewhere and they go fishing, and he takes a bottle of wine, cheap bottle of wine. I remember he gets to a spring and he pushes it down at the back of the spring, and then it comes out almost frozen with the sort of the chill of the spring, and then they drink it from the bottle, and the taste of this wine that is so cold and it sort of tastes a bit rusty.
Yeah.
And little moments like that I'm very fond of, actually. And so the bits of food, bits of drink, and bits of tactileness are taken from direct experience in a way.
I mean, that must play back into that kind of write what you know idea of it's things that you've researched or you've experienced yourself, and it's plucking little bits. And even though you're not a wine expert or whatever, but you've done enough research, or you've tried something yourself to be able to write with an authenticity about it.
It lends an authenticity that kind of draws, even if it's a small thing, it draws you into the book.
Exactly.
More,
yeah.
I wonder whether actually the key is, and look, who knows whether this works for my book, but I like to think it would do, is it's not necessarily the whole sweep of it. It's these little moments where you suddenly think, oh yeah, that's, I often regard, when I remember books, I reread lots of books as well. I often focus back on individual moments in books, that it's not necessarily just the plotting, or the plotting is important. You often just recall the couple of moments here and there where there's either a sentence, or there's a scene, or like I said, there's a meal or a taste or a sound that just rings very true. And for whatever reason, it chimes with something in your brain. And I think fiction at its best is a series of those moments, really, perhaps.
Yeah.
And obviously, Death Under a Little Sky, about to be out, your first novel. Now, as we've established, you've been published multiple times before, but do you have a sense, are you nervous about how it'll be received?
Oh, awful, hate it. Because also, as you guys know, it's a very long run-up.
Yeah.
So even though I'd written this thing, and it's quite weird, my book, because I'd written it more or less complete. So when they bought it and they got they ordered the second one, the first one was more or less done. It was, 85,000 words. It was a thing. So, and that was, God knows, was it 18 months ago, a year? It was a very, very long time ago. And so all I've been doing is worrying about it since that period. And it's perhaps why I enjoy the writing so much, because at least with the writing, it's just you, and it's a cliche again, but it's definitely true. It's you and your imagination. You're just sitting there. And actually, it doesn't matter really anything other than, are you feeling something? Are you achieving what you want to achieve? That bit's great. It's that moment where, we're 2 weeks away from publication. You're starting to get a couple of reviews, and people, and it's not just reviews. It used to be just reviews in newspapers where you get 4 or 5 or none. But now it's, everyone's a reviewer, which is lovely in lots of respects. I think it's great. And the democratization of this stuff, particularly for fiction, I think is really good. But you do spend your time, I was once told, don't ever look at Goodreads. I've already looked at Goodreads. And someone else told me a good tip on Goodreads, an author I was judging something with. And he said to me, if you're upset about Goodreads or worried about Goodreads, think of the book you think is the greatest book ever written.
Yeah, that's right.
And go to Goodreads, and you'll see someone give it 2 stars and say, Shakespeare, what was he really on about?
Yeah. There's a guy I follow on Twitter. I think it's Gabino Iglesias. He writes kind of horror noir novels, and he often posts 1-star reviews of, you know, universally accepted fantastic novels, and it's quite heartwarming to be like, okay, there's just idiots up there who just don't like
Anything.
objectionably great
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
So it's fine.
Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, the thing they always say, don't look at it, and you shouldn't look at it, and you can get. I mean, I wasn't familiar with NetGalley. That's a thing that I've come to see, and actually, there's so much lovely stuff there. I've had like 70 or 80 things on NetGalley, and quite a lot of them are very nice. But all I can think about is someone who says, "Oh, it's a bit slow. The start was a bit slow."
Yeah.
Start was a bit slow. And I was like, well, yeah, it was a bit slow, but I was trying to start a whole series of books. It's quite a difficult thing to do.
And you mentioned there that you also judge. I think you're a judge on the Sunday Times Young Writer Award.
Yeah.
Is that something, you know? Is it important in the publishing industry for writers to offer a support to these younger people and offer a path through, I suppose?
I think so. And I think generally speaking, I think writing is such, at one level, a heartbreaking kind of soul-searing occupation where you don't get much. One of the things I think is so important is, I think, supporting young writers. I try and say yes to judging, even though it's a lot of hassle, it's a lot of books and all of that, because I think if you can find a book that hasn't perhaps been given the attention it deserves and give it a bit of a push, it's a great thing to do. And actually, I think even outside of judging, one of the things I love about crime, I don't know if you guys agree with this, but crime seems to have this very welcoming community.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where, and I feel this, and, you know, again, one of the reasons this book exists is it's partially a love letter to the genre. It's basically saying there is an absolutely bottomless pit of amazing books out there in this genre, and this book it exists because those books existed. And so I feel very sort of positive about other books and other writers. And what I think I'm really pleased about is that does seem to be out there, that people want your book to succeed. They want people just want, you know, I think we all want books to succeed, don't we? Mm-hmm. We just want people to write books that get appreciated and people to read them and enjoy them. And that's what we all want. And it'd be lovely if it happens for us, and it'd be great if we can be a success. But we also want the thing to succeed, because at some part of us, we believe that there's something great there that deserves to generally succeed.
Definitely.
I mean, with all the changing, you know, kind of mentioned the way that the landscape's changed, the technology's changed, and obviously social media is a huge part of that. And, you know, in your view, is it important for new writers coming up to have some kind of presence online? And is that maybe more true for factual or non-fiction books, where you have to be kind of already a kind of semi-expert, on a subject?
Yeah. I don't really know the answer to this question. I mean, I think probably there is a correlation between being famous and selling books. There must be some form of correlation, although I remember the New York Times looked into that at one point and it wasn't quite as strong as you think it is. So there are people with millions of followers on Twitter who, for example, who don't sell millions of books. Mm-hmm. So I think that the notion of just being famous on social media helping, I think probably isn't there, though it might help a little bit. I think the world goes through social media, for rightly or wrongly. You know, I'd never done Instagram until this book is about to come out, and people at Harper Collins said, "Oh, why don't you try Instagram?" Because I'd done Twitter a lot, and I at the beginning certainly I felt quite temperamentally connected to Twitter. I quite like people being funny and, you know, the brevity of it. And I've got a few followers on Twitter, and Twitter is very much I'm comfortable with. I know how Twitter works. I don't understand how Instagram works. I'm constantly baffled by Instagram now. I feel I'm 42 years old and I feel like I'm sort of 70-year-old person staring puzzlement at their grandchild's phone. TikTok. Oh, I know. I'm not doing TikTok. I'm just not doing TikTok. So I think probably the good thing about social media, I think for young writers, is there is a community of people who want to like you and help you. And my experience is particularly with book side of social media, because I work in the news business, and news social media is awful. I mean, it's really mean and it's really aggressive. And but books, one I'd like to believe is a bit different to that. And I think probably that advice is, if be part of a community if you're writing, because it's a lonely old business. And whether social media will bring you riches, whether it'll mean your book sells, I've got no idea. But I kind of feel there's probably something there, particularly in fiction, where people will club together a bit more to sort of to look after you, and that's quite a nice thing.
Yeah.
I think that's true. So, I mean, Death Under a Little Sky is out, as you say, in a couple of weeks, and you've already handed in book 2. I mean, what is in the pipeline for you?
Well, I did a deal a couple of weeks ago. There's 4. I've done a deal for 4. So I sold 2, wrote the second one, and then as we were just getting to the point of publication for the first one, they said, "Oh, we'd like 2 more," and I've written the first. So there's 4. Now, this may never happen. The thing I love most in the world are giant series of books. And you can name virtually anything. I love John D. MacDonald, who's an old American guy from the 60s. You know, the Morse books. I'm reading one at the minute. Nicola Upson writes these detective novels set with where the central character is Josephine Tay, who's a crime author from the 1930s. I love a series. Mm-hmm. My greatest ambition in life would be to have an omnibus. I love omnibus books. You know what I mean? When you get 3 in three in one book, they're brilliant. You know, I just think they're so good. I would love to have one of them one day. I mean, I'm sure I won't do, but that's what. So the dream would be that this works well enough that this is a thing I could write loads of.
Yeah.
If that doesn't happen, I'm definitely going to write. Well, I'm definitely going to publish 4 of them. And if they stop wanting to publish them, there's a very, very strong chance there's just me sitting there by myself writing them for my wife. And there'll be the Jake Jackson 11th book of the series. No one will ever see it but my wife. And so that's why I kind of feel at the minute. I just, like I said, just finished the 3rd one. And I feel a bit bereft. I feel a bit sort of tingly in my hands, thinking maybe I need to start thinking about another one. But I've got to fix this one up first.
I know it's a sort of horror, but it can sound very pretentious. You know that you feel the need to write. You have to write and stuff. But it is true. I think when you enjoy it, then it is. Yeah, it is something that you just actually find yourself wanting to do when you've got those 2 hours when you're in the car at 3 a.m. like you are. These sorts of things, that it is just something that makes you happy. So that's why most writers do it. They don't actually set out to make lots of money out of it.
No, and why else would you do it? You can't do it unless you have to.
No, I think that's right.
I tell you, there are a couple of those cliches, like you said, I have to do it that annoys you, or the character spoke to me. That's always the great breathy thing that people say. And I'm not really buying any of that. But there is that compulsion. Because if you don't have that compulsion, there's plenty in life to stop you doing it. And at some point, you've got to just get over the hump of that, haven't you? And maybe that's just because you feel you have to do it.
Yeah, definitely. What was the last book that you read?
I'm currently, the last one I finished was Rex Stout's Black Orchids, which is a detective novel in the 1940s, I think. Huge in America. Nero Wolfe is the detective. I'm not sure it's that read well over here. They were massive in America. He sold millions and millions of copies. And what I'm still reading at the minute is Nicola Upson 9 Lessons, which is part of her Josephine Tay series.
Brilliant.
Nice. What about the last film that you watched?
This is not great. I don't watch many films now. I think it was Super Bad.
Oh, that's a great film.
A classic.
Yeah. So basically, my film consumption now is purely nostalgia. So basically, if it was kind of broad humor in the late 1990s, I'm there, basically.
Nice. And what about last TV show that you watched or are watching?
So I watch with my kids. I go to bed at 8:30 at night, so I don't watch anything current. So I watch stuff with my kids just before I go to bed, and we are watching How I Met Your Mother.
All right, okay.
She's a early 2000s, so I'm advancing forward. American TV sitcom. My kids really like it, and I like it as well.
Excellent.
Nice. And the very, very last thing we always do is a super quick fire, either or. And I always say there's no right answer here apart from one of them. But we'll start off with James Elroy or Lee Child.
Oh, that's brutal. Lee Child has blurred my Death Under a Little Sky. I cannot go against that. So I'm going to go Lee Child.
TV or cinema?
TV.
Night Owl or Early Bird?
I mean,
I know it's kind of an obvious.
If you could choose, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah.
If I could choose, I would be an early bird, but not quite as painfully early as I am at the minute.
Music or no music when you're writing?
Music, classical music. And I think Philip Pullman gets really angry about that. In a sort of
angry about a lot of stuff, I think.
Yeah, he's in a faintly pompous way that it's not giving respect enough to classical music. But I've made it a sort of Pavlovian thing. So I listen to various classical mixes you just get, and that's the signal to my brain that I'm writing.
Okay. And the last one, real book or ebook?
Real book.
Yeah, I should have known with the bookcase behind you.
Yeah, exactly.
What if I'd asked you, audiobook or ebook?
I would probably say ebook, but I really like the pace of reading. I've got nothing against audiobook. I think audiobooks are really brilliant developments. And I think actually, Death in a Little Sky has been read by a great actor. I think more people will get to it because of audiobooks. So I do like them, but I like controlling the pace of reading. And to me, that means my eyes and a page, even if it's an electronic page.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UK Page 1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.